The Galactic Republic was decaying, the bureaucratic deadlock and rampant corruption feeding the power of ruthless megacorporations and criminal cartels, undermining the government's authority. In the far reaches of the Outer Rim, the Republic had no power, and the Hutts reigned supreme. It was into this environment that both Anakin Skywalker and General Grievous were born. Anakin Skywalker was born 42 years before the Battle of Yavin. The son of Shmi Skywalker, he spent his formative years as a slave on Tatooine before his latent Force sensitivity was discovered by the maverick Jedi Qui-Gon Jinn, who spirited Anakin away to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant for training. Apprenticed to Obi-Wan Kenobi, a former student of Qui-Gon's, Anakin quickly established himself as the most talented student of his generation, though his arrogance and aloofness earned him few friends. Furthermore, his traumatic childhood left him emotionally unstable and prone to violence, a trait that was worsened by the corrosive influence of Supreme Chancellor Palpatine. He became dangerously infatuated with the Naboo Senator Padme Amidala, entering into an illicit relationship with her, and during a return trip to Tatooine to check up on his mother, he discovered that she had been abducted and murdered by a tribe of Tusken Raiders. He butchered the tribe to the last child. Directly involved in the Battle of Geonosis, the first engagement of the Clone Wars, Anakin stepped up as a battlefield commander in the newly formed Grand Army of the Republic. Kenobi and Skywalker distinguished themselves as the Republic's most effective military assets, and they became the poster boys for the war effort. 2.5 years into the war, Anakin was finally knighted. Yet mere months later, he and Kenobi were contacted by Mace Windu, who delivered grievous news. General Grievous was born Chimaean Jai Shilal of Kali, and he first came to prominence during the Huk invasion of his homeworld, approximately 34 years before the Battle of Yavin. During the conflict, he fought alongside the warrior Rondaru Lij Kumar, and the two of them attained legendary status among their people. When Kumar was slain in battle, the distraught Shilal assumed the name of Grievous and unleashed hell upon the Huk, waging a genocidal campaign that brought the fight to their doorstep. In desperation, the Huk appealed to the Galactic Republic for aid, portraying the Kaleesh as unprovoked aggressors. The Jedi were dispatched to put down Grievous's forces, while the Republic imposed crippling economic sanctions upon Kali. In the aftermath, Grievous was forced to accept a position as enforcer and debt collector for the intergalactic banking clan in exchange for economic aid to his homeworld. However, he retained a rebellious streak, and in the wake of renewed hostilities with the Huk, he abandoned his post and returned home to again lead his people. The IBC, determined to retain control of this pawn, colluded with Count Dooku to sabotage Grievous's personal shuttle, resulting in a crash that left the general near death. With his broken body suspended in a Bacta tank, Grievous was presented with a new offer. In exchange for being rebuilt as a cyborg, he would step up as the supreme military commander for the nascent Confederacy of Independent Systems in the coming war, which would give him the opportunity to exact his revenge upon the Galactic Republic and the Jedi Order for their hand in the rape of Kali. When the Clone Wars began, General Grievous's strategic brilliance allowed him to inflict costly defeats upon Republic forces on an almost regular basis, while his cyborg body combined with Count Dooku's tutelage in the Jedi arts allowed him to rack up a serious body count of Jedi Knights. With his reputation as the Scourge of the Republic firmly established, Grievous was contacted by the secret puppet master behind the Confederacy, Darth Sidious, who delivered the orders that Grievous had waited 3 long years for. Clearly, due to the sample audio from the 2003 Clone Wars microseries that I included in the final edit, the original upload of Anakin Skywalker vs. General Grievous has been blocked on YouTube. Fortunately, I still have the project file saved in my editing software, which made re-editing exceptionally easy. Furthermore, I decided to take this opportunity to re-record the voiceover, as the original audio was taken while I was dealing with some microphone troubles. However, I will be following the original script, as my opinion on this matchup has not changed. As I stated in the original, my overall analyses will be based purely upon pre-2008 Legends continuity material, specifically omitting the 2008 Clone Wars animated series. In essence, the numerous and arbitrary retcons of TCW took what was previously one of the most tightly plotted and internally consistent timeframes within the expanded universe, where every event and storyline was given an exact date down to the week, and reduced it to a muddled sliding scale continuity defined by simplistic and contrived plotlines centered around a childish moral. Where the original Clone Wars microseries kept its portrayal of Anakin Skywalker consistent with the films while also going a long way towards salvaging that version of the character, TCW reduced Anakin to a bland heroic caricature, with only the most token lip service paid to his emerging dark side tendencies, and he was otherwise almost completely sidelined in favor of Ahsoka Tano. As for General Grievous, his portrayal remains consistent with the films in the worst possible way, continuing his downward spiral into ineffectual slapstick villainy. Even the episodes where he is meant to be taken seriously reduce him to fleeing for his life or play his dismemberments for laughs. But more than anything else, my intention with this matchup is to cater to my generation of Star Wars fans, the children of the 90s who grew up with the prequel trilogy. This is Anakin Skywalker and General Grievous as they were for someone stepping into the cinema in 2005 after just having finished watching the Clone Wars microseries. My analyses of Anakin Skywalker and General Grievous will be drawn from their appearances in the Star Wars prequel trilogy, including the novelizations, comics, and visual dictionaries, the Clone Wars microseries and its tie-in digest comics, the 2002 Clone Wars video game, the Star Wars Republic comic series, the General Grievous comic mini-series, the Visionaries comic anthology, and the new essential guides to chronology, alien species, droids, weapons and technology, and the Force, among many others. Anakin Skywalker and General Grievous, accomplished warriors and murderous butchers, with hands drenched in blood. If these two titans of the Clone Wars ever met on the battlefield, who would win? Let's begin. A 22-year-old human male, Anakin Skywalker was one of the most gifted and adept Jedi warriors of his era. At the height of his physical prime, Anakin stood at a respectable 1.85 meters and boasted a powerful athletic build. His childhood as a slave prepared him for a laborious and physically active lifestyle, and his capabilities were cultivated and brought to fruition by Jedi martial arts training. A veteran physical combatant, he took his fair share of hits in battle, specifically distinguished by facial dueling scars inflicted by the Dark Jedi Asajj Ventress, and a prosthetic right arm, the legacy of his first duel with Count Dooku. Even when compared to non-humans, Anakin was one of the most physically able Jedi in the Order, his performance levels being nothing less than Olympian. A notable demonstration of his physical might was during the Mustafar duel, when he came close to overpowering Obi-Wan Kenobi with brutal hand-to-hand combat. Strength and speed were the crux of his fighting style, Dooku comparing the power of his lightsaber blows to a meteor strike, while the Jedi bounty hunter Dirge, himself a seasoned Jedi killer, credited Anakin as the fastest Jedi he had ever fought. This high level of physical output was reinforced by his exceptional stamina and resiliency, which he demonstrated on many occasions. He survived the arena massacre on Geonosis, endured Dooku's Force Lightning, and went on to battle the Master Swordsman almost to a draw. Against Asajj Ventress on Yavin 4, he endured her telekinetic pummeling, digging deep and ultimately overpowering her. And he endured the pain of thrusting his prosthetic arm into the seismic generator on Nelvon in order to destroy it, though this resulted in the destruction of the prosthesis, necessitating a replacement. Custom made, it was designed and built by Anakin himself, intended as a sturdy replacement rather than a cosmetic disguise. The arm lacked the typical covering of synthetic skin, and instead the skeletal armature was bulked up by metal reinforcements, intended to match the proportions of his original human arm. The prosthetic provided him with superhuman grip strength sufficient to shred metal, and could be used as an effective bludgeon. Though Anakin came to prefer the prosthetic to his original arm, the incident on Nelvon demonstrated that he considered it disposable. In fact, over the course of his entire life as a Jedi and Sith, Anakin lost his right arm a grand total of 7 times. The initial amputation by Dooku on Geonosis, the first lost prosthetic on Nelvon, the second lost prosthetic cut off by Jedi Master Sui Choi on Kessel after Anakin's fall, the third hand taken off by the Starkiller clone's lightsaber throw on Kamino, the fourth hand amputated by Emperor Palpatine as punishment for the destruction of the first Death Star, the fifth prosthetic lost on Mimban at the hands of Luke Skywalker, at the time empowered by the spirit of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the final amputation on board the second Death Star, when Luke successfully overpowered Darth Vader's defenses. One of the reasons for why I was so bothered by the portrayal of General Grievous in the Revenge of the Sith film and later in TCW was because I never bought into their justification for it, that Grievous's cybernetics were inferior to Darth Vader's, and that by extension his capabilities were a downgrade. While the technology that went into Vader's armor was unquestionably more advanced, the medical droids that rebuilt him were constrained by the need to retain as much of his living tissue as possible in order to preserve his connection to the Force, as well as the fact that they almost literally threw the suit together in an afternoon. With Grievous, the Geonosian technicians had the luxury of time, as he was in no immediate danger despite his grievous injuries, and they were free to replace all of his non-essential biological components with prosthetics, rather than trying to sustain them with cumbersome life support gear. Where Vader's maimed body was encased within an armored shell and was otherwise largely unaltered, Grievous was completely rebuilt, with only his heart, lungs, brain, and spinal column being retained. While there were certain alterations that Grievous was unaware of, he did have a great deal of input in the design of his new body, resulting in a form intended to terrify. With a body designed to look like a twisted meld of a Krath wardroid and a humanoid skeleton, and a face crafted in imitation of the original skull mask that he wore as a Kaleesh warlord, complete with his actual living eyes set into its sockets, he certainly cut a nightmarish figure, though this obsession with aesthetics betrayed the General's vanity. Grievous's levels of physical performance were intended specifically to rival those of Force-enhanced Jedi. Combat computers and peripheral processors slaved to his brain granted him vastly heightened reaction times, which allowed him to more effectively employ his mechanical speed and strength. He could move faster than the human eye could perceive, shred metal with his bare hands, and casually lift and throw objects weighing hundreds of pounds. Though he generally favored traditionally humanoid stances and movements, all of his joints possessed an omnidirectional range of motion, which allowed him to perform otherwise impossible maneuvers. This advantage was reinforced by the fact that his arms and hands could divide lengthwise, providing him with an extra set. As his clawed feet could be used as hands and repulsor lifts built into his legs allowed him to hover, Grievous was technically capable of wielding up to 6 weapons at a time, though he has never been witnessed doing so. This astronomical level of physical and combat performance was backed up by an extremely robust and durable body built for hard combat. His chassis was machined from heavy-duty duranium alloy, and his external plates were composed of energy-dampening armorplast. By his own estimation, he could withstand a blast from a starfighter's laser cannon, and conventional weapons such as blasters, vibroblades, and electrostabs were basically useless against him. However, there were limits to the general's resiliency. His frame was only partially lightsaber resistant, leading to multiple limb amputations, and the remaining organs contained within his chest cavity were a vulnerable target and his most consistent weakness. Mace Windu defeated Grievous twice by crushing his chest cavity, first with a telekinetically thrown stap on Boz-Pity, and later with a direct application of Force Crush during the Battle of Coruscant, the cumulative injuries resulting in a persistent hacking cough that he displayed during his final days. In fact, he was ultimately slain when Obi-Wan Kenobi managed to tear open the armored carapace and fire a blaster into the gap, igniting the preservative oils within his gut sac and painfully incinerating the general's remaining biological components. As Rowan Shrine noted, Grievous attempted to compensate by building his fighting style around protecting his core, and he relied heavily on psychological warfare to break the composure of Jedi opponents and prevent them from using the Force against him. While his ultimate fate was a clear demonstration of the holes in this strategy, his storied track record spoke to his overall success. In conclusion, General Grievous was devastating and lethal, a true and literal killing machine. This conclusion is pretty obvious. Anakin's power in the Force allows him to match Grievous's speed and strength, but he cannot compete with Grievous's resiliency or his flexibility. Grievous's heavy duranium chassis and armorplast plating allows him to withstand punishment that would leave Anakin a burnt-out husk. His multiple limbs allow him to endure amputations with only a marginal reduction in effectiveness, and the omnidirectional range of motion in all of his joints makes him a more effective physical combatant. Anakin's prosthesis allows him to partially compete with Grievous, and I could see him using it to cause some serious damage to Grievous's vitals in close quarters combat, but at the end of the day, he's still just a squishy meat bag. General Grievous gets the edge for physical capabilities. To put it bluntly, Anakin Skywalker was an anomaly. A virgin birth seemingly conceived by the Force itself, he was the most strongly attuned Force adept of all time, boasting a midichlorian count in excess of 20,000 per cell. As a Jedi trainee, he was the most talented student of his generation and wielded advanced practical ability, though he never fully accepted the philosophy, instead displaying a dark influence. Anakin trained as a Jedi Guardian, the combat specialists of the Jedi Order, and active crusaders against injustice, a mandate which aligned with his militancy. His training as a Jedi took place during a period of social unrest leading up to galactic war, and his mentality reflected the times. He chafed under the authority of the Jedi Council, demanding greater freedom to act, yet when on assignment, he conducted himself as a martial enforcer. Furthermore, as so much of Anakin's development took place on the battlefields of the Clone Wars, he never learned reverence for the Force, instead regarding it as a tool to be used and abused, a perception encouraged by Chancellor Palpatine. A master lightsaber duelist, Anakin's primary focus was Force-based physical enhancement, a power he demonstrated since childhood, specifically enhanced reflexes when piloting. Jedi training would flesh this out to include augmented agility and strength, both of which became major components in his fighting style. These capabilities were further bolstered by his natural aptitude for dark rage, his mounting frustration leading to a loss of emotional control that ironically made him more dangerous and powerful. Anakin also possessed a natural gift for precognition and farsight, experiencing prophetic dreams and visions on a semi-regular basis, as well as feeding into the enhancement of reflex. A skillful telepath, Anakin was capable of using mind tricks to influence even large groups, such as when he calmed the patrons of the Outlander Club on Coruscant after Kenobi disarmed Zam Wesell. Additionally, he could use Beast Trick to calm and influence animals, the definitive example being when he tamed and mounted the Reek in the Geonosian arena. However, as Obi-Wan Kenobi noted, Anakin strongly preferred machines over living mounts, never comfortable riding anything with a mind of its own. Though never outright stated, given his mechanical aptitude, I believe that Anakin possessed a gift for Mechuduru, building droids, modding starfighters, and customizing his own prosthesis. Turning our attention to Anakin's specific combative abilities, he boasted a strong active defense, yet his passive defense left something to be desired. He could beef up his telekinetic barrier to shoulder through force pushes, or he could directly parry such strikes with his own, but he was frequently caught off guard and staggered. He could blast aside thrown objects or cut them out of the air with his lightsaber, but he was frequently caught off guard and battered. And he never developed skill with energy-based powers of any sort, so his only defense against Force lightning was to absorb the bolts with his lightsaber, at least when he wasn't caught off guard and electrocuted. Anakin was of the opinion that the best defense was a strong offense, so this is where he channeled most of his power to devastating effect. Though his only offensive power was telekinesis, he was not lacking for either magnitude or range of application. He employed direct force pushes to stagger opponents, blasting them into walls or off ledges. On the battlefield, he used powerful force waves to scatter massed groups of enemies. In all situations, he used telekinetic throws to turn anything not bolted down into a lethal projectile. He particularly favored lightsaber throws, which became one of his preferred methods for dispatching enemy formations. However, Anakin also strongly favored force grip, which he used to throttle targets or crush their rib cages. He typically did this to enemies on the battlefield, though he has used this against allies or subordinates as an intimidation tactic. When Anakin's head was in the game, his applications of the Force were quite similar to Obi-Wan Kenobi's in their direct efficiency. However, where Kenobi favored taking the path of least resistance, using subtle telekinetic nudges to trigger Rube Goldbergian chain reactions of destruction, Anakin preferred to directly leverage his power, tearing aside and crushing the opposition, oftentimes quite literally. He was brutal and excessive, typically enhancing his powers by channeling his rage. While his approach was extremely blunt, the simplicity of his methods did allow for surprising ingenuity in certain situations, a good example being when he took a wall of explosive charges placed by the bounty hunter Dirge and telekinetically threw them at his adversary. However, Anakin's primary focus was lightsaber combat, using the Force almost exclusively as a supplement, and his applications were generally quite reactive. When he did use the Force in combat, he aggressively spammed certain powers, but he often needed to be provoked into using it. not because he was unwilling, but because it simply wasn't his first instinct. He much preferred overpowering adversaries with physical combat to overwhelming them with ethereal combat. Anakin Skywalker was a contradiction, the most naturally gifted Force adept of all time, but completely ignorant of the higher mysteries. He was content to coast on natural talent, focusing only on those powers that he felt he had a use for, resulting in an extremely uneven skill set. Sadly, he represented what so many of the Jedi of the time were becoming, their journey into the Force colored and corrupted by the violence surrounding them. As Count Dooku observed, Anakin Skywalker was half Sith already and didn't even know it. Grievous's ability to engage Jedi targets was determined in large part by his ability to undermine or neutralize their Force abilities. His primary method for achieving this was to try and break his opponent's concentration and focus with intimidation tactics and psychological warfare, preventing them from bringing their full power to bear against him. However, when these efforts failed him, he was entirely capable of mounting an active defense, evading telekinetic surges and cutting thrown objects out of the air with his lightsabers. Worst case scenario, his mechanical body was robust enough that it could usually tank the hits, though it did have its limits. While broader pushes and shoves would do little more than stagger him or throw him off his feet, Grievous was vulnerable against focused grips and crushes, which could damage his chassis or injure his remaining internal organs. By this same token, he has been subdued by thrown objects when propelled with sufficient force. Additionally, though his mental and emotional instability made him difficult to influence, this hurdle could be overcome by sufficiently skilled telepaths, though it is worth noting that the only Force wielder who actually achieved this was Palpatine. So now to examine the viability of Grievous's tricks against Anakin Skywalker. To start, Grievous's psychological warfare tactics would backfire, as breaking Anakin's focus and concentration only causes him to give in to his emotions, ultimately feeding his power. However, Anakin typically channeled this power into lightsaber combat rather than unleashing his Force abilities, and though his application of physical augmentation was truly exceptional, it was nothing that Grievous hadn't already contended with. Anakin's reluctance to employ his combative Force abilities is a huge advantage in Grievous's corner, as otherwise Anakin would be extremely well optimized to take Grievous down. If Anakin were to employ the Force against Grievous, he would almost certainly use Force Grip, which would allow him to dispatch the cyborg almost immediately. Fortunately for Grievous, Anakin is much happier pounding targets into submission with lightsaber combat, which ends up playing into Grievous's hands. While Grievous's subversions would be less effective against Anakin, Anakin's viability as a combative Force wielder is undercut by his own bad habits, and this battle would ultimately be decided by lightsaber combat. Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber was of a simple standard model, but elegantly designed and solidly constructed from alloy metals. 28 centimeters in length, the weapon was distinguished by the thick ridged hand grip, the throttle-style activator, and the curved emitter shroud. It was fitted with a blue-hued Ilum crystal, known to generate lightsaber blades with respectable cutting power and excellent handling. As in all other areas, Anakin Skywalker was a natural talent with the lightsaber, rapidly surpassing his peers and attaining a level of skill comparable to the great masters of the Order in less than half the time. Being such a gifted warrior, it really was no surprise that he became such a legendary battlefield commander, the poster boy for the Jedi War effort. A veteran lightsaber duelist, in addition to defeating Count Dooku, he participated in multiple engagements with the Separatist commander Asajj Ventress and kept his skills honed through regular sparring matches with Obi-Wan Kenobi. And of course there was that one time he butchered a significant percentage of the Jedi Order literally overnight, where his master built his skill set with tactical considerations and survivability in mind, specializing in the defense-oriented Surisu form. Anakin was preoccupied with his quest for might and power, dedicating himself to the aggressive Form 5. Built around the tactic of following up defensive maneuvers with immediate counters, Form 5 expressed itself through two variations: Xian for blast deflection, Jensaarai for lightsaber dueling. Anakin initially trained in Xian, though as the Clone Wars progressed, Jensaarai became his primary focus, his mastery of the strength-oriented art so absolute that Dooku regarded Skywalker as the finest Jensaarai stylist that he had ever seen. He supplemented this specialization with an advanced application of Ataru, the elaborately acrobatic fourth form, a practice he favored for its dramatic flair. He also possessed some knowledge in Forms 1 and 6, though they served mainly to inform certain aspects of his technique and generally didn't feature in his style. Though Anakin's tactics and battlefield conduct were diametrically opposed to Obi-Wan's, he still wore his master's influence on his sleeves. Thanks to their years of experience training and fighting together, their techniques closely mirrored each other, with any differences between them being the result of Anakin's conscious attempts to distance himself from Kenobi. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Anakin's application of pure Jensaarai, which I find to be quite appropriate as Form 5 is, in essence, Form 3 adapted for offense. Behind the flashy and bold style was a direct and efficient core moveset, perfect for both quick counters and tight defense, while hammering on opponents with rapid-fire power blows. However, his grounded footwork reduced his mobility and left him vulnerable to physical combat techniques. To get around this, he personalized his technique and effectively hybridized Jensaarai and Ataru, pairing off Form 5 style blade work and attacks with Form 4 style acrobatics and footwork. The result was a trade-off. On the one hand, he overcame Jensai's immobility and amped up his offensive output, but at the complete expense of defensive viability. Despite this shortcoming, this dynamic method was Anakin's go-to response in almost all situations, simply working in Xian-style deflections when on the battlefield, though purest applications of both Jensaarai and Ataru remained major tools in his arsenal. While his pure Ataru technique was rather conventional, it served as the basis for his skills in Jarkai dual-blade fencing. However, Anakin was a swordsman through and through, and when forced to engage in hand-to-hand combat, he was little more than a brawler. Additionally, he was also adept at chaining force-based telekinetic strikes into his lightsaber sequences, particularly favoring the lightsaber throw. I would describe Anakin Skywalker's approach to military strategy as improvisation supported by preparation. As described in the novel Jedi Trial, he placed a heavy focus on organization and logistics, but he was not a planner, his goal being to simply ensure that everything around him was functioning smoothly and predictably in order to free himself up to do his own thing. This mentality carried over to how he dealt with the enemy, emphasizing intelligence gathering and being perfectly willing to personally go out on scouting missions. Skywalker was not a grand strategist, he was a boots-on-the-ground frontline commander, and in his tactics he overwhelmingly favored the direct approach. While this sometimes entailed covert ops, more often than not he was leading a frontal assault on major strategic targets. Simply put, regardless of the situation or the number of options that he had at his disposal, Anakin would always take the Death Star trench run approach. He always took the most extreme, high-risk option because it was the most expedient path to victory and because intense combat situations like that were his idea of fun. The only reason for why Anakin's tactics were even remotely workable was because he was one of the few beings with the power and skill to pull them off, and because they were completely unexpected on account of being otherwise utterly reckless and insane. However, these advantages did not carry over to single combat, and his emphasis on direct offense switched over from unexpected to predictable. That's not to say that he lacked variation in how he applied his techniques, as he was actually quite flexible in this regard, but all of his decisions were motivated by aggression, not tactical considerations. He fights harder, not smarter. The only time Anakin ever displayed clever tactics was when fighting alongside Kenobi, a good example being when they opened their final engagement with Dooku by employing their less effective secondary styles to lull the Count into a false sense of security before suddenly switching over to their primary techniques to surprise him, using a hammer and anvil strategy to batter him into submission, Anakin pounding on the Count with Jensaarai, while Kenobi blocked his retreat with Sarisu. However, when operating alone, Anakin never stopped being the hammer, and due to this, I think it's safe to say that all of the brilliant strategies they employed as a pair can be attributed almost solely to Kenobi. As a result of this high-risk, high-reward approach and his extreme aggression, Anakin was guaranteed to either utterly crush the opposition or be utterly crushed in turn, and I think it's worth noting that almost every major lightsaber duel that he has participated in has ended with someone suffering a traumatic amputation. His situation was worsened by his emotional instability, which left him extremely vulnerable to psychological warfare. He was easily manipulated and flew off the handle with little provocation. While Anakin was at his most dangerous when enraged, the power granted by his anger allowing him to achieve his most impressive victories, he was also at his most reckless, all of his defeats being entirely due to him overextending and leaving himself completely exposed. On the one hand, Anakin Skywalker was a nigh unstoppable offensive heavyweight who accomplished the impossible and made it look easy, and a truly gifted swordsman capable of overcoming the great masters of his era. But on the other hand, he was a dangerously unhinged Leroy Jenkins, and if he wasn't a main character, he'd be a red shirt. Where Anakin Skywalker was the poster boy for the Republic war effort, General Grievous was regarded as the evil genius behind the Confederacy, the perpetrator of their greatest atrocities. Already a cunning and experienced warrior, Grievous's cybernetic reconstruction combined with Count Dooku's training in the Jedi arts made him a devastating physical combatant. The most infamous and successful Jedi killer of the era, he was capable of contending even with reigning Jedi swordmasters in lightsaber combat, having defeated the likes of Shaak-Ti, Ki-Adi-Mundi, and Adi Gallia, and surviving an engagement with Mace Windu. General Grievous's lightsaber collection was extensive, but the four he carried with him were his personal favorites. Originally constructed by the Jedi Kakruk, Jamar, Puroth, and Nistamal, all four lightsabers followed the standard mold and were fairly nondescript, with the exception of Kakruk's lightsaber, which featured a set of emitter guards. 2 emitted green blades, 2 emitted blue blades, all were fitted with Ilum crystals. Grievous was provided with training in all 7 classical forms of lightsaber combat, as well as various alternative disciplines. Though capable with a single blade, Grievous overwhelmingly favored dual wielding, marking him as a clear Jarkai specialist. Many of Grievous's opponents commented on Dooku's clear influence on the general's technique, indicating that Makashi was one of his primary styles, appropriate given the art's emphasis on lightsaber dueling. However, Grievous's application of his skills was much closer to that of a combat-oriented Nyman specialist, switching through the various forms on the fly in order to confuse and bewilder his targets. To put it plainly, Grievous's lightsaber style was effectively the movesets and attack sequences of all 7 forms plugged into a random number generator. This method was enabled by Grievous's bizarre mechanical anatomy, which allowed him to perform otherwise impossible maneuvers and contortions. His capabilities were further augmented by his ability to analyze and imitate the fighting styles of his opponents, the most impressive instance being when he copied the physical technique of Vapad during his fight with Mace Windu. Grievous alternated between dual-wielding and quad-wielding, opening with twin lightsabers with the extra set kept in reserve. His dual saber style paired off heavy power blows with dynamic spins and acrobatics, building momentum and hammering on the opponent's defenses. His four-bladed style was based around rapid-fire weaving attack sequences, paired off with more grounded footwork and postures. The Revenge of the Sith novelization described him as spinning the four weapons in a flourishing velocity so fast and so seamlessly integrated that he seemed to stand within a pulsing sphere of blue-green energy. And during the fight with Kenobi, he maintained a continuous assault of 12 strikes per second and was capable of ramping up his output to as high as 20 per second. But as formidable as he was, Grievous was not invincible. As Dooku observed, Grievous could be confused by unpredictability and had no finesse. As his entire fighting style was designed to dominate in a head-to-head engagement, he was ineffective against more evasive opponents, and his overemphasis on offense left him exposed to counterattack. Both Dooku and Kenobi bested Grievous by assuming defensive stances, forcing the cyborg to chase after them before abruptly turning around and disarming him. Aware of the shortcomings of this pupil, Count Dooku taught Grievous to make heavy use of psychological warfare tactics, keeping his adversaries off their game to ensure that they didn't wise up and exploit Grievous's weaknesses.
Don't let your pursuit of trinkets cloud your reality. Remember what I taught you, General. If you are to succeed in combat against the best of the Jedi, you must have fear, surprise, and intimidation on your side. For if any one element is lacking, it would be best for you to retreat. You must break them before you engage them. Only then will you ensure victory and have your trophy.
Grievous's goals in battle were to get his opponents reeling backwards in bewilderment, or better yet, goad them into a reckless counteroffensive so he could use his multiple lightsabers to eviscerate them with defensive counters. Despite this, Grievous went out of his way to seize the initiative, typically playing the instigator. His first action was theatrical posturing to shock and intimidate, often through excessive displays of brutality. He would immediately follow up with a progressively escalating heavy offensive, tearing through the opponent's defenses before they had a chance to respond. Radically unconventional maneuvers and tricks provided an additional layer of bewilderment to his assaults. In military engagements, he favored brutal surprise attacks, bringing his forces in right on top of the enemy and laying into them as quickly as possible. He favored multi-pronged assaults intended to force the enemy to divide their attention while also concealing his strategic objectives through the seemingly random arrangement of his own forces. In lightsaber duels, he would make a point of entering the arena in some ostentatious or unexpected manner, and would often precede engagements with verbal taunts and pronouncements of doom. As previously stated, he would open with conventional dual-wielding assaults, with quad-wielding kept in reserve for especially challenging opponents. His tactics of distraction and disorientation were reflected in his technique through his use of feints, drawing an opponent's attention with one weapon while slipping in another to bypass their defenses and score hits. In summary, General Grievous was dangerously unpredictable, but was ultimately subject to set mechanical limits, and as unconventional as he was, he adhered closely to his own pattern. Functionally, he blended the linear focus of Count Dooku with the trickster tactics of Exar Kun, bewildering opponents with bizarre techniques and exploiting overzealous retaliations to slip in fatal counters. The problem is how overspecialized he is, and how vulnerable he is to the very tactics he employs. The greatest strength and weakness of General Grievous is that he is a true killing machine. Anakin Skywalker's fighting style is designed to directly leverage his strength in the Force in order to overwhelm the opponent as swiftly as possible, and thanks to his prodigious level of power, he was typically successful. But on those rare occasions where brute force wasn't enough, Anakin Skywalker's overcommitment to offense left him totally exposed, leading to his catastrophic defeat in multiple instances. Despite the obvious flaws in this approach to combat, it was extremely common within the Jedi Order, and as a result, it became the approach that General Grievous was specifically optimized to combat. Anakin Skywalker does possess the skill and experience necessary to defeat Grievous. He has seen major components in both Grievous's fighting style and tactics from Asajj Ventress and from Grievous's Magna Guard, the latter specifically using a scaled-down version of Grievous's own technique. Anakin even used the specific approach of defense and counter that Grievous was weak against to defeat the Magna Guard in question. If Anakin Skywalker kept a cool head and fought smart, his victory over General Grievous would be a foregone conclusion. However, this would not be the case. Even if we disregard Anakin's existing hatred of Grievous, Anakin's instinct against especially challenging opponents is to dig deep and fight harder, not smarter. And then we consider General Grievous's psychological warfare tactics. While Grievous wouldn't be able to break Anakin's focus, he would be able to break Anakin's self-control. While there is the risk that Anakin may choose to manhandle Grievous with telekinesis, another automatic victory situation, it's far more likely that he would hit Grievous with lightsaber combat, so the question is whether or not Anakin's high performance level would allow him to achieve the impossible and overwhelm Grievous. Short answer, no. The novel Labyrinth of Evil depicted General Grievous going head-to-head with Mace Windu and battling him to a stalemate, with Windu opting to end the engagement by blindsiding Grievous with telekinesis. In a broad sense, Windu's Vapad technique had the same function as Anakin Skywalker's Gem So: leverage strength in the Force into physical combat and overwhelm the assailant. If Windu couldn't overwhelm Grievous, Anakin can't either. And due to his emotional instability and arrogance, Anakin would be the last person to realize this. Which brings us to the question of how effective General Grievous's counters would be against Anakin, and we already know the answer to that. To be fair, Anakin Skywalker's remarkable skill level and advanced technique would allow him to pose a serious and credible threat to General Grievous, his tight and direct core moveset being an effective foil for Grievous's flamboyantly erratic multi-style, and his experience against advanced Jarkai masters such as Asajj Ventress puts him on equal footing with Grievous's dual saber style. Even against Grievous's quad blade style, I could see Anakin briefly contending, his sheer output allowing him to bat aside many of Grievous's attacks with his own. However, doing so would push him to the absolute limit, and when Grievous ramped up his own output, Anakin simply wouldn't have anything more to give. In a heartbeat, Anakin Skywalker would be sliced to ribbons, and General Grievous would add a new lightsaber to his collection. I declare General Grievous the victor.